Matthew 5:41. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain.
Good morning. 1927 was a year where I believe that humanity kind of lost it entirely. You know, there's pretty much every generation. It's like we can pick out a group of people or a certain person where we're like we can hold them up on a pedestal and say, all right, they are the epitome of insanity or the epitome of a crazy person. But in 1927, a group of people decided to get together and put together this transcontinental race spanning from New York to California, and it was a foot race. Now, if you know anything about history at all, you know that by the time you get to 1927, there are already some amazing inventions that have been invented. One of them is the car. One of them is the airplane has already been around at this point. There are boats. There are several ways to get around. There is no need for running, especially that distance, anymore. But there was one person that decided to make this run. Now, it was 3,600 miles long from New York to California. And this guy, John Salmano, decides to make this entire journey. And he sets off in 1927. And he runs, and he runs, and he runs. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the app Couch to 5K. If you know what that is, if you don't, I'll just explain really quickly here. It's an app that you can get on your phone, on your iPad, and basically it helps you to work your way up to a 5K, which is 3 miles and some change for those of you that are into running. But it's to help you work into this ability to run a 5K. I've done it before, and it's sad. In fact, me running at all is sad, and it's very embarrassing and awkward looking. But even doing a 5K was very difficult. But this guy, John Salmano, decides to run all of it, and he does it. He completes the whole thing. He ran from New York to California, and I don't know how we're still not talking about that guy very much today, because that distance, I just typed it into my GPS, and it is ridiculous how far this guy ran. But he did it in 72 days. But he ran the entire distance, and that is the furthest anybody has ever run on foot to the date. Now, I don't think anybody's going to beat that record, especially today after John was talking about how many people just aren't working. You know, there's a lot of lazy people in the world today, so it won't be this generation. Maybe the next one, someone will decide to run further than that. But the Bible talks about running a lot, and there might be some of those passages that come to mind in your head where you can think of where it talks about we're in a race, and it's an endurance race. It's not a sprint, and we've talked about that before. Now, we probably heard lessons like that before, but we have James chapter 1 talking about life is a race. And then you have Galatians chapter 5, which talks about life being a race. You have 2 Corinthians chapter 9 talking about how life is a race. 2 Peter talks about how we're sojourners in this world, meaning we are on a journey. We're not meant to stay in this world, but we're on our way out. In fact, the moment we're born into this world, we are on a journey out of the world. And we're going to talk about one particular mile, if you didn't catch the Bible verse that we had this morning, the second mile. And now, compared to all of these other passages that we have in the Bible about distance and going the distance and making these long runs, and compared to that trek from New York to California, the second mile doesn't sound that hard. But I want to talk about this morning how that second mile relates not only to us, but also how that one extra mile is a lot harder than some of the other miles we might have to trek in this life. And I also want to talk about how this verse has been used today. So if you want to go ahead and open up to Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to be looking specifically at 41 through 43. But if you have a red letter Bible, you'll know that this is a section where Jesus is preaching. He's delivering this sermon, and he covers lots of different topics. Now, in school, we were taught, in Bible school, we were taught that when you're putting together a lesson, what you need to do is you need to first come up with your text, your scripture, and you need to have your topic, and you need to basically stick to that topic. Now, Jesus, being the Son of God, had the ability to break all of those rules, and he did that all the time. When he praught and he got up and spoke, or when he taught to people, he would cover, many times, he would cover all different kinds of topics, and he would just move on from one to the next, and this is no different. So Jesus is in this section right here, There's a lot, so we're not going to talk about his entire lesson, but it's excellent if you haven't read through this particular sermon. But when we get to this section right here, Jesus is talking about loving your enemies. Now, I did a lesson on this not too long ago. We were talking about what exactly that means to love your enemies, and maybe why that was lost on us culturally, because I don't think we describe people too much, at least in our everyday lives that we come in contact with, as our enemies or our, even our neighbors. And we'll talk about that in a second too, because enemies is just kind of a strong term. But Jesus is in the middle of talking about their enemies. And to the Jewish people, this was the enemy was right there at their doorstep, and they faced the enemy all the time. But if you look at this verse in particular, this is a verse that's not just quoted inside the church, but also by those outside the church in the secular world. And this is even used, Matthew 5:41, as a business model or name. And in fact, if you just look up on Google, not right now, but later, if you look up on Google, just type in second mile, you'll have all these different businesses that will pop up, and they use it as kind of their tagline or their slogan. So it'll be second mile dentistry, or second mile construction, or second mile financial, and on the list goes. It's been used a lot, but when you look at what Jesus is actually talking about in this section, it makes no sense at all how people have used this as their business model. So if you're thinking about opening up a business, or maybe in the future you're thinking about doing that after you graduate school or whatever, this is just one of those names not to use. Just scratch it off your list. One, it's already been done, and two, it makes no sense for the world that we live in today, at least how it's been used. It's not talking about paying customers, it's talking about your enemies, because Jesus is in that section talking about your enemies. And you might have heard a little bit of the background of this verse before. We're going to cover that, but mainly what we're going to focus on this morning is what the second mile means for us today. So number one, the second mile is about spiritual maturity. So if you look at what's going on as Jesus is talking to these people, and we see he opens up with the Beatitudes, and he's going through, and he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who are meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are those who are merciful. Blessed are those who are pure in heart. Blessed are those that are peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of God." And that's the one I want to focus on right there as far as Beatitudes in verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. Now, here's a glimpse into the world at the time in which the audience that Jesus is preaching to, this is their everyday. You had Roman soldiers, when they were on a march, especially if they were going to battle, they were known to march upwards of 22 miles in a single day. Now, if anything, maybe this lesson is a reminder to you about how many incredibly fit people were alive all throughout history, and what's happening these days. But they would hike 22 miles. Not only that, but they would carry all of their gear, which weighed more than 44 pounds. And that may not sound like that much to you, especially in looking at the context here. But he says in verse 41, "Whoever compels you to go 1 mile, then go with him 2." Now, Jesus is obviously not talking about fitness, but here's what Jesus is talking about. The Romans, they were the first to create a road-type system, and they would mark each mile with a post. And so under Roman law, what a Roman soldier could do, if they were on one of these long march, whether it be a training drill or whether they were just marching through the town towards battle, one of their 22-mile treks that day, they could grab somebody. They could grab a Jewish person, and they could pull them in line with them, and then they could take off 44 pounds worth of gear, and they could strap it onto that person, that Jewish person, and could force that person, under law, could force that Jew to walk 1 mile carrying that soldier's weight to help ease the burden of carrying all of that gear. Now, 44 pounds may not sound like something that's that heavy. If you picked up a 45-pound dumbbell before, I know John has, and he's kind of the exception because he can pick up like way more than that. But if you just pick one of those up in Walmart, or just even a 40-pound weight, you can heave it up off the shelf, and you can hold on to it. And it's not too hard, but have you ever tried to give a little child a piggyback ride? Now, at first, it doesn't seem that hard. Now, I've given Camden here a few piggyback rides before, and maybe a few others. Don't get any ideas, kids, here. I'm in my churchy clothes. But when they first hop on your back, these little kids, and you grab onto them, they're not that heavy. And you can run around and do sprints around the auditorium, run around the parking lot, but it does not take long for that 40-pound kid to quickly begin to feel like 200 pounds. And maybe that's my level of endurance, but it doesn't take that long. So a mile and 44 pounds can get heavy as you go along, but it was more than that. The burden that they were carrying was more than just the weight. It was humiliating. They were the Romans, and they hated the people that they were being forced to work with. And so if you put it into that context and that kind of framework there, since they were forced to walk 1 mile, let's just think about it from our own standpoint here. What would you do? What would our culture or society do today if we were forced into work for 1 mile? I think many of us would be pulling out our GPS, or we would be counting in our head. There's 5,280 feet in a mile, and so each time we're walking, we're just counting down, and as soon as we get to that mile marker, then we're going to drop that weight and then turn around and walk off. And a lot of Jewish people did that, and we'll talk about what fueled that in just a second, outside of the fact that, well, they were being forced into work by the Romans. But Jesus tells them to, whoever compels you, whoever forces you to go 1 mile, then go with him 2. Give to him who asks from you, and from someone who wants to borrow from you, and do not turn away. You've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And that's really where we get into the meat of our subject here and what Jesus is really driving at here. Going the second mile, number 1, means spiritual maturity. Can we look past our hatred for someone in order to accomplish the will of Christ? And that's really what Jesus will be driving at, and what those other points are going to hinge underneath. So when Jesus is saying, I want you to go the second mile, he's not talking about an actual mile. In fact, the Roman mile was different than ours. It's actually less than our mile today. But what he's saying is, can you look past your hatred for that person from the just counting down the steps until you can drop off that weight? Can you go the second mile and start a conversation with this person, have some more spiritual maturity about it than just our heart being filled with hatred towards the Romans? So he's talking about spiritual maturity when it comes to loving your enemy and just moving past that and looking at the bigger picture. But he's also talking about, when it comes to the second mile, about making a statement, and that has to do with the attitude. So a Roman soldier, if you were marching and you were grabbing these Jewish men and you were throwing your gear on them, each mile, each chance that you could get, the typical response that you would get from a Jewish person would be that of loathing. There'd be a whole lot of attitude going on there. And so Jesus is showing us what the potential power of our attitude and of our mindset can be. We can make a statement if we act differently than the rest of the world would. And really, when Jesus is teaching, if you could sum up his entire lesson, the whole point of his lesson is to act differently, to be different than what people are expecting. And so as Jesus is telling them to go the second mile, it brings that attitude to light, where we're thinking about the average Jewish person maybe glancing over at the Roman, or just waiting for that mile to come up when he can dump that load off on the ground. It's changing that attitude. What if you did it and you weren't sarcastic, or you weren't giving that Roman soldier attitude? What if you carried that load with a different attitude? And so it's about making a statement. But the other point when it comes to making the second mile at number 3 is that it is about distance. It's a reminder that the journey has an end in sight. And so we'll talk about that here in a second. But where did this come from? Because when you get down to verse 43, this is a verse that has made a lot of biblical scholars even scratch their heads, where he says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your enemy, or you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, who says that? And where have they heard that? Because Jesus is speaking to, if you look up in verse 1 of chapter 5, seeing the multitudes. There are several hundreds of people that were there listening to Jesus. They have all gathered to listen to Jesus preach this sermon. And so Jesus makes a blanket statement. You have heard it. Obviously, this is a popular teaching. You've heard it said that you should love your neighbor and that you should hate your enemy. Now, that is so strange to us, because we know where the love your neighbor comes from. Leviticus chapter 19, that is a command that God gave us to love your neighbor. Now, The word neighbor has been lost in translation here, or you might have a different version there that says countrymen or kinsmen, which is a more accurate translation there. But neighbor is not talking about those people that live right next door to you, but it's talking about someone that is of your own blood. Now, there is a great lesson in here, I think, for Americans today, especially with all of the different crazy events that are happening down at the border, and just really the atmosphere that's in our nation today. What Jesus is trying to get across to them is loving everybody and loving people with a different kind of love. Not just your neighbor, not just your kinsmen, not just those Americans, not just those Jewish people, but everybody, and to love your enemies. And so your enemies, obviously, that one is a strange line because, again, you have Leviticus chapter 19, which says to love your neighbor. But where have they heard it said that you shall hate your enemies, or that you should hate anybody? It might not be a surprise to you knowing the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but they were the ones that kind of came up with this law. They were from the Qumran sect. There's this very particular sect of religious leaders who developed this law that they added to the law of Christ, or the law of Moses, which they did all the time. They just came up with their own little rules. And so they came up with another one that was basically not, you shall love your neighbor, but also, on the other side of that, you shall hate your enemy. Now, when you look at, again, at the culture of this time, you can see where that comes from and where the temptation to create such a law is, because the Romans were notoriously cruel. Roman soldiers were very cruel. The Roman method of conquering the world at the time was a very cruel method, because they would walk into a nation and they would basically kill all of the tribes that were there except for the boys, except for the young kids, and they would brainwash them into Roman society or Hellenize them, and then they would basically just conquer tearing families apart, creating basically mass chaos whenever they walked into a country or a state. And so Jesus is saying, or you can hear where these teachings are coming from when you have these Qumran sects, these religious leaders that will get up into the synagogues, and when they have all of their listeners, their pupils here, you have different teachers that are getting up and teaching, you shall love your own kinsmen, and where that temptation to also create the law, and you shall hate your enemy, the Romans. But if we bring that into our society today, who is that? Who are our enemies? Who are our neighbors? When you think of neighbor, maybe think of that as someone that you have something in common with, someone that you can relate to, your countrymen, your kinsmen, someone that you care about and that you believe should be in your group, in your circle, that deserves your respect. And anybody outside that circle of respect, you can think of that in terms of other nations, maybe other people that have come from other countries into America, and we can put that stamp on them like they are outside of our circle, we don't have anything in common with them, and so they are our enemy. And so you have this idea of you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. The love part that Jesus is talking about here, he does not contradict. You shall love your neighbor, but you shall also love your enemies. And of course, that love there is that sacrificial love. It's not really that warm, fuzzy feeling that we might think of when it comes to love, as if you need to like somebody. But it's going the second mile involves distance. Now, this is one of those encouraging reminders, because this is a difficult section. If you think about what the message behind what Jesus is saying, you shall love your enemies and then give to those that beg from you. Now, that verse is another one of those verses that I believe is one of those one that maybe might make us scratch our head, or maybe it's just something that's difficult to hear. And that's in verse 42. Give to him who asks of you, and from someone who wants to borrow something from you, don't turn him away. Now, have you ever stopped at a red light before, at a underpass or one of the exits, maybe down towards the university? There are people that will come up to your window at a red light, and they will knock on your window, and they will ask you for something. Now, what is the typical response? Now, you may not think this way, but I know a lot of people do. It's lock the doors, roll the window up, and not talk, don't look at the person, just wait for the light to turn green, and then drive on. That is a common response, and we see it all the time in this world. But Jesus is saying not to question their motives, not to look at them and think, well, if I give this person money, if I give this person something, he's just going to turn around and abuse what I've done, so therefore I'm not going to do it. Jesus is saying if someone comes up to you and asks you for something or wants to borrow something from you, don't turn them away and don't say no. He didn't say to judge that person or to basically profile them and say, like, I'm not going to do this. But basically the message is there is to give to those that might even be hard to give to. And so to the Jewish people he's talking about, the Romans, to us today, we can fill in the blank there when it comes to maybe a family member or friend who asks you for something and we might begrudgingly give it to that person. It's all about the attitude. But the distance is when he actually uses this term here, go with him 2 miles. Now, Jesus is not talking about an actual mile. So he's not commanding the Jewish people. Now look, the Romans are going to force you to go 1 mile. And what I want you to do is once you get to that mile post, just go one more. Because then there would be the same problem there. The Jews would have this weight on their shoulders, and they would be walking, and as soon as they got to that mile marker, they would just be counting down again till they got to the 2nd mile marker, and they'd still just be shooting death looks over at the Roman soldier that forced them to carry all of that gear. But what Jesus is giving that reminder is that there is a point in which you stop, and so make the most of that time. Now, 44 pounds gets heavier the more that you walk. The further that you go, it becomes heavier and heavier and heavier. Now, the reminder for us today is any load that we have, anything that we're carrying in our lives that might be considered some baggage or some weight that we have, it probably gets heavier the more time that goes on. But the reminder is there is a stopping point. And so what we do between mile markers is very important. The opportunities that we have between those mile markers are so important that we need to pay attention to those things, potential conversations, and maybe to the Jewish person what that meant was act differently in your attitude and carrying that load, but also look at the person next to you differently. Look at him as a soul. Look at that person, that Roman soldier, as someone that the plan of salvation also was going to be for him. What Jesus was also going to die for that person as well. So in between the mile markers, then maybe start a conversation with that Roman soldier that forced you into play. And that mile marker that you have around, maybe make an impact on the other Jews that saw that Roman soldier grab you and put that weight on your shoulders. And so for us, we have a load that we're carrying through life, but instead of thinking about the load on our back or thinking about how much we hate and how miserable we are between the mile markers, then the reminder from Jesus is there is an end in sight. The distance is going to close, and what we do between those mile markers is really what matters. Jesus helps them carry this load. The mental frame of mind in which he tries to get these Jewish people to get into before carrying this load made all the difference in the world. Do you know what a stair stepper is? Have you ever seen a stair stepper? Basically, it's stairs that go on forever and they don't stop. It is the worst invention ever. Now, I know this whole lesson is like, man, he hates cardio. I do. But outside of that, it's just a fact. No one wants to get on stairs that don't ever end. The point of going upstairs is because they actually go somewhere and there's a purpose to it. Now, if you have a fridge upstairs, there's even more reason and motivation to go up the stairs. But if you just go to a gym and you just see stairs going and going and going, it's miserable. And then right in front of your face, usually there's this little handheld grip and there's this little timer right there. And the seconds just creep by. And if they're counting the stairs, it's just 1 stair, 2 stairs, 3 stairs. And by the time you get to 10 stairs, you're so done with being on a staircase that goes to nowhere. What Jesus is telling us is that the stairs that you are walking right now, as miserable as it might be, the stairs end. And where they end is somewhere that you want to go. And when you look back, you won't think, I just walked upstairs to nowhere. You'll look back and think, I walked upstairs that took me to this place right here, which is eventually paradise. And no matter what load you have, there is an end in sight. And if there's a load that you're having a hard time carrying this morning, then hopefully this is something for you that gives you some encouragement as you're carrying that load through this life, but also maybe it's helping you look at who the answer is and where the answer lies, and that is in Jesus. Jesus can help you carry that load. Jesus can change your entire mindset and how you carry and why you're carrying that load in the first place and in this world. If there's something that we can help you with, if there is something that we can help as far as something that you are dealing with in your life and we can help you carry that load somehow, then why not let us know? We can pray for you, but also maybe look on more of the physical side, if there's something we can come and help you do or be involved in your life somehow, then why not reach out to some people here and let us see if we can help you out. We're God's family. If you're not a part of it, then hopefully you see the benefits of being in the family of Christ and also seeing how important it is to give Jesus every burden that we have to carry in this life. If there's something we can do for you this morning, then why not come as we stand and as we sing.